Hey, Underground Sessions podcast listeners, Pastor Bob here, live at the Contend Conference 2025. We are resisting the drift, and as a bonus to the whole conference, we are doing a few different podcasts. I am doing, in this episode, interviewing Neil Shenvi on the issue of critical theory. What is it? Why should Christians care? He's written two books. He's written one book called Why Believe on apologetics and another book called Critical Dilemma on critical theory in general. And that's the topic of our conversation today. I think you'll find this conversation really informative and helpful. Enjoy it. Stick around. All right, so Neil, welcome to the Underground Sessions podcast. We're so glad that you're here. How was your flight up?
It was short and easy. Hour and a half.
Wonderful. I know I've done that. Was it from Charlotte or was it from Raleigh-Durham?
Raleigh-Durham.
Raleigh-Durham. Okay, so nice, kind of like jumping over the pond to get up
I
here.
didn't even get a cookie.
What?
Nothing. No snacks.
Did you fly United?
Yeah.
Oh, United. You know what?
They try to pour me water into a cup. I didn't even get forget it. Never mind.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're gonna have to talk to the hub here in Newark and make sure we start getting more cookies on that. Well, we're so glad that Neil is here on the podcast with us today. Neil, as I mentioned in the opening, has written two books. You've only written two books, right? Is there another one on the presses, or?
There's one on the way.
There's one on the way. So two and one on the way. It's kind of like you're starting a family of libraries here. So he's got this book, Why Believe? A Reasoned Approach to Christianity, which I mentioned before I've read, and I think is a refreshingly, not a different take on apologetics, but he's got some new arguments, some new ways of seeing things that I hadn't heard before. So I definitely recommend this book. And then his big book, this big book right here, Critical Dilemma, The Rise of Critical Theories and Social Justice Ideologies, Implications for the Church and Society, co-written with Pat Sawyer. So this is going to be the bulk of our conversation today because critical theory is sort of the conversation of the day, I think, although it seems to be waning a little bit. I don't know if you would agree with that, but it's
definitely Trump has put a damper on the
yes, yeah, kind of the DEI and all that other stuff. Well, why don't I ask you this to get us started? How did you get into, I would say, like in the evangelical world, you seem to be like the expert on this, or at least the perceived expert on this, as it comes to maybe a lay perspective. How did this become like your thing?
Around 2016, 2015, I began noticing a shift in our culture, both in the culture at large and the evangelical church in particular, about how we spoke about topics like race, class, gender, even sexuality. And I knew something was wrong with it. I was hearing phrases and words I didn't really understand. And so a lot of us, I think, felt uncomfortable, but I didn't have a language. I didn't have a framework to understand what was going on. And then I providentially met my co-author, Dr. Pat Sawyer, who is getting a PhD in the critical tradition, in critical pedagogy at UNC Greensboro. He's now on faculty there. And when I met him, we began talking about our shared interest in apologetics. But when I heard his area of research, suddenly things clicked. I was like, oh, that sounds a lot like what I'm hearing in the culture and even in parts of the church. And at first he was incredulous. He didn't think that any Bible-believing Christian could possibly be embracing these ideas because he was doing his PhD as sort of outreach in part to his secular colleagues, these very progressive, agnostic people. And when he heard that there were Christians embracing these ideas, he thought that's not possible. So we actually went back and forth for a few weeks, and he came to see, yes, it was indeed a problem in the church as well as the culture, and that led to a 7-year-long friendship and collaboration.
Yeah, wonderful. So maybe one of the things to say, Neil's talking tonight at we're actually recording this live at our Contend Conference if you're watching this later on, and you may have heard Neil's talk on Saturday night already, and he's also preaching on Sunday. But I think a lot of people, just like you, didn't have language for it. But behind it is this idea called critical theory, which whenever I talk with people, and we're doing Elisa's study on deconstruction in one of our Sunday school classes, and I was talking about the chapter where she starts to get into the critical theory stuff, so I sort of explained it very briefly, and then I said, you got to come hear Neil, because Neil's going to give a much fuller explanation of what critical theory is. My experience with critical theory up until the recent years was I was a lit major in college, and I took a class on critical theory as part of my lit major, and I got to tell you, I just did not quite understand it. Like there was things like you got to read this text from 200 years ago, but you can't take into account what the author's original intent was. You have to read it like this is like in your context today. So what is critical theory? What exactly is it?
Right. So it's a very slippery term. So critical theory can refer to the Frankfurt School. It's a bunch of sociologists and philosophers working in the 1920s and 30s in Germany and Frankfurt. They later came to the U.S., Columbia, and they were very influential in the ideas that influenced the New Left, the countercultural movement in the 50s and 60s. They were involved in that. But since that time, critical theory has turned into kind of an umbrella category for various critical social theories. So theories like critical race theory, queer theory, critical pedagogy, post-colonial theory, these are all part of this broad category of critical theory. And why are they all related? They all aim to expose how power operates within societies to produce winners and losers, oppressors and the oppressed, the marginalized, and those who have power. So that's what they're all trying to do. They see below the surface of how society purports to operate, and to see who really is pulling the strings and how certain groups gain power. And that framework's shared by all these critical social theories, which is what they have in common.
Yeah. So is it as simple, I've heard it described, is it as simple as saying they're separating, these people that are advocating this, separating everybody into an oppressed and oppressor class, or is it more complicated than that?
That's one of the big ideas within critical theory, broadly construed. It does go back to Karl Marx. The critical tradition really started with Karl Marx, and he, of course, analyzed society along lines of the rich and the poor, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And then the Frankfurt School expanded his critique to include an analysis of culture, not just class and economics. And then later critical theorists, like those in critical race theory, then took his ideas and applied them to race. So you have whites oppressing people of color. Second wave feminists saw men oppressing women. Queer theorists see cisgendered heterosexuals as oppressing LGBTQ people in general. So you can kind of see how all of those all those theories fit the same framework, which is again why they have the same historical source to a large extent. But yeah, it is applied much more broadly than just race.
Yeah, so could you give me I do want to come back to the race discussion, but before we get there, could you give me some other examples of what would be an example of where we would see this worldview ideology playing itself out?
So in the academy, you have actual disciplines like post-colonial theory. Again, the oppressors and oppressed are the colonizers versus the colonized. In critical pedagogy, this is interesting, this is sort of Pat's field. In critical pedagogy, there's not really classes per se, but they're interested in how education reinforces social stratification. So in some sense, it's a little odd, it's going to sound odd, but they would see teachers as oppressing students. Now, they wouldn't use that language per se, but they would say that actually teachers are viewed as this authority figure and therefore reinforce society's norms and values on these impressionable students. So that even in the classroom, there's these power dynamics that tend to marginalize students. And that all these theories, by the way, are very activist. Going back to Frankfurt School and the Horkheimer, the difference between traditional theory and critical theory in his mind was that traditional theory wanted to just describe the world as it is, whereas critical theories always want to change the world. They want to change it for the better.
The revolution.
That's right. Well, this goes back to Marx, right? So
Right.
even Marx criticized, I think it's theses on Feuerbach, one of them was that so far philosophers have only aimed to describe the world, but the point is to change it. So this really does go back to Marx, and which is why some people just think it's just Marxism applied to race or Marxism applied to gender. It's actually more complicated than that, but that's in a phrase. It's not a bad way to think about it.
Okay. So the colloquial term that's thrown out there is the term wokeness.
Yeah.
So is wokeness, in terms of how it's being described in the media, in culture, is that the same thing as critical theory? Or and if not, what's the difference?
So I would say that wokeness is the cultural expression of these academic theories, if that makes sense. So what you see downstream in the culture around the water cooler, in the media, phrases that get thrown around like white fragility, white privilege, cisgender, heterosexism, ableism, those phrases do come from an academic discipline. They are in the literature. They're used by scholar activists So they're not coming from nowhere. On the other hand, they've often gone through a sort of mistranslation process. So some of what the woke people and culture say is not even quite right, based on what the scholars are saying. But it's, and the other thing that complicates it too is that sometimes conservatives will label literally anything woke. I think I just saw on Twitter today, someone like saw that a black woman was cast in some role, and it was just some fictional role. It was not even like she's representing some European president. No, it was like she was cast in some random role, fictional role. Like, that's woke. Like, well, wait, what? I don't think that's. Maybe she was great for the. I don't even know.
Yeah.
But it's so when we overuse the term, we can end up diluting it. We want to be very careful to say, well, no, just happening to have a black actress in this role does not necessarily mean it's woke, and we should be careful to not use that term purely as a pejorative. We want to describe these theories accurately rather than just blasting them, because we want people to realize they're actually wrong. They're not just unpalatable. We don't. It's just that they're deeply, fundamentally unbiblical.
Yeah. Well, this morning, Elisa Childers was doing her talk on her book, Live Your Truth, and we talked a lot about slogans. So I sort of wonder if the whole idea of that's just woke is becoming a slogan, but on the conservative side. And not that some of the ideas are not problematic, but it's just, well, like you said, everything, well, that's just woke because I don't like it, basically.
It's the little boy who cried wolf, right?
Right.
You keep calling everything woke, pretty much people ignore what you're saying. Whereas we want to be much more precise and say, no, I'm using this term. And actually, in our book, we point to the literature. There's a paper called We Are Woke, and it's written by, this is the actual term they use, 3 women, WOMXN, I don't know how to pronounce that, of color, defining what wokeness is. And their 2017 paper on International Journal of Multicultural Education, I believe. But it's a real peer-reviewed article on what wokeness is, and that's how we use the term. So we don't want to use it carelessly.
Yeah. Well, if I remember correctly, I've heard people say that wokeness has a history of, it was originally being used because people became awake to problems within society that they didn't see before they started to see with a new lens. And to me, that doesn't seem like inherently that's a problem, but it's taken on this larger meaning. And some parts of that are problematic.
Right. So in our book, we use the phrase contemporary critical theory, which is wholly neutral. No one can accuse us of just smearing people. And we talk about why those ideas, regardless of the label, are bad ideas, and that they're not compatible with Christian ideas.
Okay. So I want to get to that. I want to ask one question before I go there. I interviewed Os Guinness at one of our events a number of years ago, and he talked about this phrase, the long march through the institutions. So you talked about the 1930, the Frankfurt School, and the ideas, how far they stem back to Marx. And he basically, in this interview, made the argument that some of these ideas have just been making their way through academia, and in the last, let's say, 10 years, they've become mainstream. And now we see it everywhere within popular culture. Would you say, is that true?
Yes.
Okay.
So if you look back, you can actually just watch it unfolding. So these theories originated with Marx, sure, but then the Frankfurt School. And then the Frankfurt School became very influential in the academy in the 60s. Postmodern theorists like Foucault and Derrida. I think Michel Foucault is the most cited scholar in history. So he's incredibly influential.
Yes.
So postmodernism is a critical social theory as well. It also tries to see how power operates subtly. So his ideas, they were very popular in the academy. And then if you read actually James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose's book, Cynical Theories, they also trace these ideas in 3 stages. The first is sort of a sort of theoretical postmodernism. And then the second, and that lasted until like the early 80s. Then they have applied postmodernism in the academy from the 80s until 2010 or so. And that was when these ideas that were very abstract were then applied to activism within the academy. But then around 2010, I think they say we get to a stage they call reified postmodernism, where now it's just in the water. It's the lingua franca of the marketplace. We all talk in terms of white privilege and heterosexism.
And it's just assumed. It's not challenged. Yeah.
And I think that's why it's important to see that process, because it makes you realize that these aren't the product of people carefully reflecting on issues like race, class, gender, sexuality. They just imbibed it from the magazines, culture, media, entertainment, Twitter. So
Right.
that's why it's important for us.
X, Neil.
X. It will always be Twitter to me. But it's important for us as Christians especially to step back and ask, how should we be transforming the renewing of our minds when we think about these ideas? We can't just accept everything that comes down the cultural pipeline. We have to be careful and say, and hold up to Scripture and ask, are these ideas good and true and biblical?
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, so that probably gets us to the question of it's been a major discussion within the church, particularly on the racial discussion. Is critical theory something that Christians should embrace or reject?
So I would say short answer, reject.
Okay.
Longer answer is that there are elements of truth contained within all these theories that we would be actually very naive to reject because they're just true. I mean, it's sort of like asking, should Christians embrace or reject psychology? You're like, I don't really want to give a single answer, right? Well, there's some things that psychologists say that are actually very true. We're talking about Freudian psychoanalysis. We're talking about cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's a huge field. In the same way, you want to be a little careful in saying just reject the whole knowledge area because there are things they say that are just actually true and helpful. So, but I think given where we are as a culture, I think the first answer should be no. Fundamentally, they're wrong about reality. Even though we should acknowledge that, yeah, there are some things that are helpful and beneficial that we can take from their theorizing.
Okay. So I guess when it comes then to the racial discussion, both in society and within the church, if critical theory is not the best way to have it, what is a better way? How would you guide us to think about that?
Right. So interestingly, I would say that we can start with something we share with critical race theorists, which is the acknowledgement that race is a social construct. They're emphatic about that, and it's true. There's one race, the human race. Acts 17, we see Paul saying, from one man God created all men, that we're fundamentally, we share a human nature, we're all sinners, and we all need this one Savior. There's only one Savior for all men, Jesus Christ. So we can affirm that there's not like there's one human species, basically. Well, where do we get the idea of race then? These big buckets of black, white, Asian that we use in the U.S. today. Well, they were manufactured in the 1800s mainly, and unfortunately to justify slavery, to justify why the white race was the best race and the other races could be subordinated to the white race. You can look back at, and interestingly, in the 1700s, it was so powerful, this idea that there were separate, distinct human races, that they were dabbling and fiddling with a thing called polygenesis, the idea that there were multiple human pairs. There was not one Adam and Eve. There's a black Adam and Eve. So I think Thomas Jefferson even dabbled in polygenesis theory. And we want to see as Christians, no. And actually, interesting, to their credit, Christians were like, absolutely not. That's not the story of reality is that there's one human pair from which all of us come. But the point is that social idea that you can put people in these neat buckets of white, black, and Asian, and maybe American Indian, there were various categories they had. That's something that we developed. And now people today say, wait a minute. Are you denying that there are, ethnicities that are real, or that some people just came from Africa, others came from Europe, and that's clearly objectively true. You're not going all postmodernist on us. The next thing you're going to deconstruct is gender, right? The next shoot of fall is, then gender also is a social construct. Well, no, because race and gender are different categories, completely different.
Right.
For example, a man and a woman get married and have a baby. The baby is, a boy or a girl. There's two categories for humanity in terms of gender. But for race, you can be 5/8 Asian or 1/4 white. I mean, there is actually a spectrum.
Right.
So that's one area where they're clearly very different. And then another thing is that ethnicity and race are different. Ethnicity relates to common language, culture, history, ancestry is part of that. So there are various ethnic groups, and the Bible talks about the various ethnoi, right? So it's a biblical category. So we should separate out race, this big bucket of white, from things like Finnish and French and Italian and Russian. Those are ethnicities. So basically just use biblical categories.
Cool. So there's a category that people will throw out in this conversation called whiteness. Does that term refer to only white people? Like, I think that's what people assume when it's thrown out. Well, that's just whiteness. How does that play into this conversation?
Yeah,
'Cause
right.
That's a very common thing I hear.
You have to understand, this is an important point. Critical theorists have redefined all kinds of common terms. They'll use the same words, but they're not using them the same way. So things like justice, oppression, gender, but also whiteness. In the dictionary, whiteness refers to having light-colored skin, or being part of this white racial category. Critical race theorists have redefined the term to refer to a set of ideas or ideology, a way of being in the world. That's whiteness. And it's associated with privilege, having social advantages because of your perceived race. And because of that, though, anyone can participate in whiteness as the ideology. There's an amazing article in the LA Times, I think, and the title was "The Black Face of White Supremacy." And it was because Larry Elder, who's a conservative black radio host, was, I think, running for governor, but they called him...
But he still embodied whiteness. Right.
Because it's not about skin color, or even about your actual ethnic background, or it's about your ideology and whether you receive privilege from your way of being in the world. So you got to be careful. Do not assume that because someone utters the word social justice or privilege, don't assume the worst and think they're just a critical race theorist. But two, don't assume they're using the word the way that you would use it. Ask them what they mean.
Yeah. And then when we're talking about things like systematic racism, my understanding of that is that that's also based on this power dynamic. And if you are white, you are automatically racist no matter what. And if you are black, you are automatically you can't
oppressed.
be racist.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So there is some people do say that. Usually they distinguish between that idea and systemic racism. And so again, these are all intertwined, but you can't assume that someone who says systemic racism does buy into that.
Different
idea.
people can mean different things when they say it.
The most common understanding of systemic racism is the idea that racial disparities are produced by systemic racism. So that where you see these disparities, de facto, there must be underlying discrimination of some kind. And any law, any system that produces disparities is systemically racist. But in our book, we talk about how that can't possibly be right because, for example, the NBA is 80% black. There's massive disparities there in terms of but no one in their right mind thinks that there's anything discriminatory going on. The fact is there are a lot of great black players. Wonderful. So it's a meritocracy. So we should not. So that fundamentally, the premise that any disparity is due to something bad and unjust, that's false.
Yeah.
And we can talk about, is it possible for systems and laws to be unjust? Of course it is. Can those produce disparities? Of course they can. Can we be open to the possibility they might be doing that? Of course. We just can't assume it.
Yeah. Good. So I think in terms of the church discussion, not only is this applied to race, but also the LGBT conversation. And my understanding, at least when I've heard on that, is that people will view Christians, specifically conservative evangelical Christians, as being oppressors, and the LGBT people are those that are oppressed.
Right.
Is that people using the same critical theory framework? And is that true from your perspective?
Yeah, that's definitely being influenced by queer theory in particular, which is adopting that same critical theory.
Is a subset of critical theory?
Yes.
Okay.
Queer theory is a critical social theory, like critical race theory, like second-wave feminism, and they're adopting that oppressor-oppressed framework. And the reason they say they're oppressed, you're like, well, oppression in the dictionary is defined in terms of tyranny, cruelty, unjust treatment and control. So, but are you saying that gay people today, as a group, are being tyrannized and unjustly controlled? Again, well, how? And the answer is, well, probably they're not. But how then do you say they're oppressed? Because critical theories redefine the word oppression to refer not to cruelty and tyranny, but to refer to the subtle ways that powerful groups impose their values on culture. So anytime you have a hegemonic group like whites, men who have the ability to impose
Christians,
exactly right. They have the ability to impose their values on culture. That's oppression, and therefore anyone who falls under that that system of ideas is oppressed. The marginalized groups are oppressed, and that's why people of color are oppressed by white supremacy. Women are oppressed by the patriarchy. Even if you can't point to concrete examples of, well, where were they treated cruelly? It's not about that. It's about whether they're under the system which treats them as other and which valorizes the values and norms of the ruling class. So that whole way of thinking is wrong because, for example, some norms are oppressive, sure. Some human beings create norms like slavery, Jim Crow, that are actually oppressing people. On the other hand, other norms are just true and God ordained. God ordained male and female. That's a norm in our culture that they're male and female. But you're not being oppressed if the ruling class says, no, that's true. In law, we should have male and female. That's not oppression. That's simply us recognizing that God has created the world that way.
What is a woman, right?
That's right. And they would say that answer to that question is actually a way that the patriarchy gets power over LGBTQ people. They put you in these binary buckets, and that's oppressive. But we would say, no, that's a scientific and a theological question, one that has an answer.
Right.
And answering it properly is not oppression.
Okay. Well, I want to end by asking you just give us a sense on how these ideas have made their way into the church. And I want to give you an example that I just remembered somebody had shared with me the other day. So, in the current political discussion, President Trump has come into office and he's been saying a lot of different things. One of the things that he's emphasized is this idea of manifest destiny. And somebody sent me a note from one of his friends who's a believer and was basically saying this statement now is equivalent with white supremacy. So I kind of wanted to get your take on how would you respond and interact with something like that, and then extrapolate that out to how has the church, how have believers been influenced by these ideas from your perspective?
Right. So this is again where it's important to ask people to define their terms. Ask them what white supremacy means. Now, believers in manifest destiny in the 1800s, probably some of them did believe it in a white supremacist sense, in that they wanted white people to conquer the brown and black people all over the world. They did believe that. They're like, whites are supreme, and you can find documents saying that we're going to civilize these savage brown people. On the other hand, white supremacy today is defined to refer to this system or ideology that normalizes white values. What's a white value? If you look at documents, like the Smithsonian published one, white values include things like hard work is the key to success, or
coming to work on time.
Being
right.
polite. They literally say, this is not me speaking, the Smithsonian said that emphasis on the scientific method, objective, rational, linear thinking is an element of whiteness. I was like, that sounds super racist. And they got a lot of pushback for that.
And I have a PhD in theoretical physics.
So the point is, if you define white supremacy as all of these values that we take for granted as good and normal, but are actually a way that white people get power, and they include things like science. Okay, slow down. Like, I want to know what Trump actually said, and whether what he actually said is true or false, good or bad. And before we slap a label on it, and then when you use that label, make sure you're using the label, with some biblical framework in mind. We again, some of the stuff they say, they get away with using these phrases and this jargon that people just take for granted, but you peel back the layers of it, and you're like, actually, that's a really bad and even racist idea. Like, would you really want to imply that rational thought is a white thing? No, it's a human thing, right? We're trying to think God's thoughts after him, and because we're all made in God's image, we can all do that, not just white men. So I just would urge people, don't jump to conclusions, but definitely ask for definitions, and then keep pressing them and saying, well, is that category, the way you're thinking about it, is the biblical way to think about this issue?
And then what are some of the most common ways you see this coming into the church? The evangelical church in particular. I
mean, I think it came in through the front door of race because critical race theory is viewed as just the right way to talk about race. If you want to be a serious scholar, you adopt the language of critical race theory. You talk about whiteness and white privilege, white fragility. And I think evangelicals just very naively used that lingo, and it was in the jargon. And I think it was often done with good intentions, but it was very dangerous. There's also the side door of gender. So feminists for a long time have been talking about women as an oppressed class. And oddly enough, it's taken a turn towards queer theory now, such that anyone who identifies as a woman is a woman. So you find a very loud minority of feminists saying, no, women is a biological category. Women are a biological category. And we shouldn't be
just the J.K. Rowling issue?
But they are a minority. Most feminists have gone full throttle to queer theory, and we're even seeing the church beginning to, parts of it, adopt that thinking, which is obviously very wrong, and talking about things like sexual minorities. And when you think about that, it's like we really shouldn't be wanting to equate gay people and lesbians with blacks and Hispanics or people from France. Those are not, so being from Africa or Europe or Australia, it's not a moral category, but your sexual behavior is a moral category. So we should not imply that they're somehow on the same footing. So again, just be charitable when you hear someone use that phrase. Don't jump to conclusions, but we should urge people not to use phrases like that, because it does send the wrong message to people listening that, oh yeah, there's actually a very famous book called After the Ball, written by gay activists, about how the gay liberation movement would make inroads in America. And they said we need to adopt the language of the civil rights movement. I mean, to mirror the language used by Black Americans in the 60s to achieve our goals. And they've done that. But we should say, no, that was always wrong, because sexuality versus ethnicity are just totally different categories.
Wonderful. Well, what resources would you point people to if they want to do some further digging on this issue? I know some of them are mentioned in your books, but maybe you can verbally say them.
I always say this. I know people don't listen, but it's unavoidable. You have to read primary sources. So it's indispensable to have some familiarity with the actual things that critical theorists write. One of the things that frustrates me is that I see a lot of Christians engaging with, say, critical race theory, and they're just repeating the talking points of their favorite pundit. They have never read a single book written by an actual critical race theorist. And this happens on both sides. So in our book, we make a real point to quote critical race theorists extensively in their own words. We have block quotes. We have 800 footnotes in these clear citations where we show you what they are actually saying. And that's important. So pick up the number one best book you can get as a primary source on this topic.
Critical Dilemma.
Well, that's no. That's a secondary source, guys. Listen, your favorite book by your favorite Christian author, which is 100% biblical, is still a secondary source for talking about other people's ideas. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about reading what they themselves wrote. Yeah. So if you want a primary source on Neil Shenvi's ideas, read this book. But if you want a primary source on critical theorist ideas, the best book to read is Robin DiAngelo and Özlem Sensoy wrote a book, Is Everyone Really Equal? It's not long, but it's used as a text in graduate programs. Oh, it's accessible. I can read it. It's not like a hard book to read, but it will very clearly explain what critical theorists today believe in terms of race, class, gender, physical ability, religion, etc. And it's eye-opening. So and then you'll have at least some ability to say, no, I have read this book. Another one is Chiara Bridges' CRT a Primer. She's a UC Berkeley law professor and a critical race theorist. And it's a very simple book to read. It's used in graduate courses, but my 15-year-old son could read it, and it will give you insight into what they actually believe, and it's very helpful.
Good. Well, thanks so much for giving us the time today, Neil. That was really helpful. I hope that was encouraging to you. We're looking forward to hearing your talk tonight. The book is Critical Dilemma. Go and pick it up. But also pick up the primary sources so you can read what the critical theorists are actually saying. Neil, thanks so much for being on the Underground Sessions podcast. We'll see you in a little bit.
Thanks, Bob.